Welcome to Booklaunch, the UK's most widely distributed books magazine for all intellectual interests. And in this podcast, we're wondering why a lieutenant in the army would go against his basic training. Army instructions are quite clear. If you're an officer, you don't leave a patrol and go off by yourself, especially when you're on duty in Afghanistan. Here's Michael Waterhouse reading from his new novel, Prodigal.
In my mind, I'd thought it wouldn't take long. We could drive to Rashid's house in less than 10 minutes. What I'd entirely failed to consider was the possibility, the likelihood, that the house was being watched. Had I worked through the logic of my own argument that Rashid was valuable alive, as hostage, as leverage, I would have realized that monitoring the movements of his family would follow. As it was, I drove an armoured car almost to the front door and hopped out as unconcerned as I would have been if I'd been visiting my parents for Sunday lunch. Slightly against my better judgment, I told Lucy and the others to go on ahead. My thinking was that if Rashid's family were aggravated by my last visit, they'd hardly want another bunch of army and police turning up mob-handed and unannounced. As it turned out, I needn't have worried. I knocked at the door and waited for an answer. There was a dog barking inside the house, towards the back. I knew straight away that the place was empty. The windows at the front were shuttered, and there was something about the dog's bark, the way it echoed, that gave the impression that the dog had been on its own for some time and had done a good deal of barking into vacant space. I walked around the side of the house. I knew it was a risk to leave my vehicle unattended, but I was only going to be a few minutes. I switched on my torch and threw the beam across the side wall. It was pitted with holes from various skirmishes, and slabs of plaster had fallen off, leaving patches of exposed concrete. Threads of plant had begun to grow in the holes. I glanced at my watch. I didn't want to overrun the patrol and start questions buzzing back at base. Was I scared? I don't think so. Naive, I think. Actually, I was more puzzled than anything. I couldn't imagine where the family had gone. It wasn't safe for anyone to travel far, and if Rashid had the chance to make contact, he would try his home first. There was another possibility, and that was that a member of the family, perhaps the family as a whole, had been threatened. Collaborators and their relatives were frequently intimidated, or assaulted, even murdered. If they'd been led to believe that they were in physical danger, official advice about the safety of travel would count for nothing. The family would have packed up and headed for the hills without a moment's hesitation. Rashid might have told them to. He might have got through on his mobile and told them to get the hell out. I shone the torch into the backyard. The flash of light drove the dog frantic. I could hear it throwing itself against a door. The last thing I wanted to do was attract the interest of neighbours, so I switched the torch off. The barking suddenly ceased. The silence was shocking. I felt the heat in my face. It was as if a hairdryer had just been thrust under my helmet. Sweat ran into my eyes. I looked back to the street and the Army Land Rover parked at the front. Time was running out. There was still a chance we could return to the compound and no one would be the wiser, except for the lads on duty at the gate, who would probably give me the nod. The silence was broken by rapid firing, Kalashnikovs, I was certain, and slightly later what I assumed was return fire from our lads. I was about to run out. I needed to join them, when two men appeared at the end of the alley. Bearded, black beards, armed. I saw them dimly just for a moment, hovering around the front of the vehicle. They walked back alongside it, out of sight, giving it the once-over. They appeared not to have any light with them. Had they spotted me? The chances were they'd seen my torch splashing light over the house. The gunfire stopped. I crouched down, tried to squeeze my body as close to the wall as I could. The two men re-emerged at the end of the alley. At this distance, it was impossible even to guess who they were, except to say that they were probably local militia. I kept still and tried not to think about the heat and the almost irresistible urge to get my helmet off and let some air onto my face and head. My skin was wet. One of them started up the alley. He'd raised his gun and I kept thinking, he's seen me. He must be able to see me down here. He's looking straight at me. Behind him now were two other men, so there were three of them, at least. As far as I could tell, they were identical in their flat caps, their beards, their long cloaks, their guns. They were uniform. They were even the same average-looking height. The man in the alley took a couple more hesitant steps towards me. The barrel of his gun led straight to my head. He was being extremely cautious, like a dog that's sniffed something he doesn't trust. He called out, flung his free arm in the air, beckoning. A second man came up to him and tried to peer into the dark alley. They moved forward, maybe a metre, maybe more, talking agitatedly. I couldn't move. I thought about my gun and just knew I'd be dead before I touched it. The cramp in my calves was agony. I must have been squatting by the wall for 10 minutes by now, and I was desperate to ease the pressure. It felt like I was seconds away from crying out. The first man yelled into the darkness. I couldn't make it out, and I wouldn't have understood what he was saying even if I could. And yet I did know. He was bluffing. "We know you're in there. Come out and you won't get hurt." Like fuck. As abruptly as they'd appeared, they went. The two in the alley turned, joined the third man, and then I could no longer see them. I waited, eased myself down into a sitting position, stretched out my legs. The ache in my calves intensified for a few moments, then began to fade. I thought about taking my helmet off, just for a second or two, but decided against it. That formidable silence again. There were insects close to me, busy, magnified by the alley's walls. But behind them, behind their rhythmic twitch, out there, was a deep silence. It was the interval between symphonic movements, the sound of anticipation, of fear. Gradually, taking care to move as slowly as I could so that all my wretched belts and buckles, the sodding flaps and bits of kit hanging on me, my torch and radio and gun, made little or no noise, I stood up. I tried to make out any movement around or beyond my armoured car, the slightest human hint. There was none. I decided not to risk the torch and started to make my way towards the street. I hated the crunch of my boots on the alley's concrete floor. Each step seemed to echo and linger. Inside, I was pleading with my body to be quiet. It felt like an age before I reached the street. It was empty. Corporal Lucy and the others were nowhere to be seen, presumably pinned down with the police lads further into town. I took a walk around the vehicle, had a quick look underneath. Nothing. No signs of damage. Nothing had been attached to it. Everything was in order. I had no time to reach for my weapon or shout out. An arm was around my throat, and I immediately lost my balance. I went down like a bowling pin. My helmet was ripped off, and some sort of sack was pulled over my head. I felt my legs being tied together. They lifted me up, carried me like a corpse. The pain in my throat and neck was now agony, and I struggled to breathe in the heat. The sack pressed against my face, and every time I took a breath, sackcloth clung to my nose and mouth. I felt like my head would burst. The heat felt hot as fire. It happened so quickly. Even in the quiet of the street, I had no sense of their approach. I was pushed into a vehicle. They couldn't have cared less whether I was injured in the process. My head collided with the roof as they pushed me down and threw me onto the back seat. I caught my face on the edge of the door. From the other side of the vehicle, someone else started to pull at my arms, dragging me onto some kind of bench seat. My legs were pushed up under me so that they could close the doors. I tried to shout, to get their attention, so that I could at least move myself, but either they couldn't hear me through the sack or they were too stressed to listen. A pain tore through my calf, and I thought I would pass out. The engine fired up, and the car, or whatever it was, jumped forward. I rolled on the bench and dropped to the floor. If I'd given it any thought whatsoever, I wouldn't have gone there. I was, after all, responsible for 10 men, Corporal Lucy, 3 privates, and half a dozen local police recruits. Apart from the stupidity of the plan, it was breaking regulations to leave a patrol without an officer, especially at night. I guess it was a bit of the younger Steve, resurfacing.
That was Michael Waterhouse, reading an extract from his new novel, Prodigal, published by the Conrad Press in Canterbury. The book is available from our online bookshop at a discount by visiting booklaunch.london/sales. And do subscribe also to the print version of Booklaunch by visiting booklaunch.london/subscribe.